Hey everyone, and welcome back to the adventurebook.net. I know it's been a while, and I really appreciate your patience. We have a special treat for you today. I got a lot of really good responses on my first video, which was sort of taking a photo from directly out of the camera to something that you'd want to hang up on your wall, and how to do that, and how to take that raw photo and kind of transform it with post-processing techniques. So let's go ahead and do that today. We're going to hop into Lightroom. Now I'm using Lightroom 4 here. You might be using a different software application. I love Lightroom for its non-destructive editing and its organizational capabilities. You might be using Photoshop or Photoshop Elements or Aperture. A lot of the same techniques will apply. However, I'm going to be using a lot of the tools that Lightroom gives you specifically in order to make some adjustments to this photo. So this is a photo. I took at Red Rock in the middle of last year, right after a storm, which is really the best time to go out there and take photos. Just you get these little pools of water that will dry up within the day. So you really have to be out there at the right place at the right time to capture them. So the first thing I notice about this photo is it's very overexposed. It's way too bright, it has no drama or anything like that, but I did this for a reason. It's important in digital photography, if you know you're shooting in RAW, to expose more to the right side of the histogram. Now what does that mean? Let's look at the upper right hand corner of the screen here. This is the histogram, and for my first video I explained a little bit about how that works. You have the dispersion of of brights and darks in the image, of whites and blacks, basically. So you have the darkest tones in the image on the left-hand side and the brightest tones of the image on the right-hand side. And if you notice that the histogram here is bashing up against either side, that means you're losing detail or data on one side or the other. Now, the cool thing about shooting in RAW is that sometimes, even if you look at your histogram here and you see that you've got some whites bashing up against the right-hand side of it, which means you've lost some highlight detail, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone forever, especially if it's within a certain amount of latitude of the highest tones of the image. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring the exposure down just by clicking on the middle part of the histogram here. Now another way of doing that is under the basic adjustment panel here. You can take the exposure and drag that down. Now I don't want to darken the whole image. There was a lot of dynamic range in the scene, which means there's a lot of difference between the brightest tones of the image and the darkest tones of the image. And it's impossible really to capture all the tones in the sky here, as well as all the tones down here in the foreground. Capturing all of the shadow detail and the highlight detail. Now, in extreme scenarios, I would use HDR, or high dynamic range, where I would take multiple photos at different exposures, one capturing an exposure for the sky, one capturing exposure for the foreground, and combining them in post in an application such as Photomatics, which I'm a big fan of, to bring those exposures together and get it on one image. Luckily, in this image, it really does seem like I've got all the tones in the image. I just have to massage it into place. So the first thing I'm going to do, before I do anything else, is scroll down here to the lens corrections panel. Now, I'm shooting with a Tokina 12 to 24 millimeter lens here. It's a super wide angle lens. One of the drawbacks of using a super wide angle is you get a lot of distortion in the edges of the image. You might not be able to notice it now, but what I'm going to do here is use Lightroom's ability to automatically correct these distortions. So under this lens corrections panel, I'm going to click on Profile, then check the box for Enable Profile Corrections, and then I'm going to select my lens. Now if your lens is here, I'm going to select Tokina, which is my lens, and it's already automatically figured out that it is the Tokina 12 to 24 millimeter lens, and it's automatically going to apply that profile. And if I uncheck this, you're going to see before the correction and after the correction. It doesn't make a huge difference in this image, but I like to do that because it does correct the perspective a little bit. The other thing I'm going to do is this lens has a propensity for creating something called chromatic aberrations. Now what that means, if I zoom in here, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit farther, you'll see a little bit of a purple outline on this edge here, and maybe a little bit of a green outline on this edge. It might not come through completely on the video, but trust me, it's there, and it'll be more noticeable as I start to make corrections. So what I want to do is use Lightroom's incredible magical ability to correct for these little chromatic aberrations, or this fringing is what it's also called. I'm going to click on the Color tab here in the Lens Corrections panel. Click on Remove Chromatic Aberration. Now that generally takes care of everything without much work. In this case it did that. There's more things you can do with this tool that I'll deal with in other tutorials. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out again to a little bit of a normal view here. Now the first thing I'm going to do with this image, now that we've made some basic corrections there, is I'm going to use the Gradient tool. It's up here in the upper right hand corner. I'm going to click on that. Okay. Now this is going to allow me to darken part of the image as if I were using a graduated neutral density filter. Now that kind of filter darkens part of the image while keeping the exposure the same on the rest of the image. This basically duplicates that effect in post. So I'm going to click on that tool, then I'm going to drag from the top of the image, just above the top image border, and I'm just going to drag down here. Okay. Now you're not going to see much of a difference now because I'm going to make the adjustments after I've dragged this slider down. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, which actually levels the horizon of this graduated neutral density filter. Okay. I'm going into a little bit more advanced stuff here, but believe me, it'll all be explained. It'll be very evident once you see the effect. And then I'm going to release. Now, up here in the upper right hand corner, I see all the adjustments I can make to this filter that I've applied. I've also made sure that the middle of this filter is right about where the horizon is. I can adjust that later, of course. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is take this exposure slider and drag it down. And what do I notice immediately? I've just brought back so much detail in that part of the image that I thought was lost. But I've also brought the sky back down to a normal exposure level to more match the rest of the image. So I'm doing what you would normally do in HDR software without actually having to take multiple exposures. So again, one of the benefits of shooting in RAW is that you have all this data you can work with. So I'm pretty happy with where that's at right now. What I'm also going to do is increase the contrast, which basically increases the difference between the lightest tones of the image and the darkest tones. Okay. Now notice that it's just affecting the area that I've applied this filter to, and it fades out as the filter fades out here toward the bottom. I'm also going to pop in a little bit of clarity. That kind of punches up the image just slightly. Now, one of the results of using a graduated neutral density filter is that sure, you're darkening the sky, but sometimes if you have elements in the foreground that are protruding up into the sky, you darken them a little bit more than you'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and correct for that right now. So I'm happy with this filter, what I've done, and I'm going to go ahead and click the close button up here in this little panel. All right, I'll click that now that I've made that adjustment. Now I'm going to go to the adjustment brush, and I am going to choose Dodge, or Lighten, which is already selected. You can also click on that drop down and select the kind of filter you want to use. Now all of these effects are completely customizable after you've selected them. Right now I'm going to choose Lighten, and I'm going to punch up the exposure just a little bit before I start painting onto the image. Now I'm going to use this brush to paint back brightness into areas that I've darkened a little bit too much by using the graduated neutral density filter. And I don't have to be too perfect with this, just kind of bringing along the edge here. Alright. Now once I've painted on there, I can actually go back to this exposure adjustment and punch it up a little more. So I brought back a lot of the detail. Oh, I don't want to go too far with that. You know, all of this is to taste. It's almost like a cooking show. So I've made those adjustments. I've brought the brightness back into the top part of this image here. I'm going to go ahead and click close on that. So I've already made some adjustments to the image that I'm pretty happy with, but I want to go in further detail. Okay. Now the next thing I want to do is add a little bit more contrast to the whole image. Now I'm going to go down to the tone curve panel here, and this is where I do a lot of my adjustments as far as increasing contrast or brightening the brightest parts of an image or darkening the shadows, I like to do that here because it doesn't just break it down into just the highlights and the shadows, it also breaks it down to lights and darks, which are sort of in the middle part of this histogram here. Okay? So I'm going to increase the lights, which are sort of higher aspects of the histogram, but not quite all the way up to the highlights. And maybe darken the darks just a little bit there, just to add a little bit of contrast to the whole image. Okay? So that's just punched up the contrast just slightly, and we can see before and an after. Just a little bit of punch I've added to the image, but not too much that I'm going overboard. Now the next thing that I want to do is that I have this beautiful reflection in the water down here, and it's not really coming across in the image. Now one of the amazing things in Lightroom 4 is now with the adjustment brush, which I'm going to go back up here to upper right hand corner, click on the adjustment brush, and I'm now going to adjust the temperature or the white balance, which is basically the color temperature of the image. Now sometimes you want to make a white balance adjustment for the whole image, but in this case I just want to specify just the reflection in the water down here, which was much more vibrant, much more blue than it's appearing. So I'm using this temperature slider and bringing it down to sort of a cool setting, more to the blue end of the spectrum. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of my brush here. Now you can use the scroll wheel, or if you're using a trackpad, you could scroll up or down in order to increase or decrease the size of the brush. And I'm just going to go ahead and paint right on that area. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller so I can get closer into this area here. There we go. And just kind of fill just where the reflection is hitting. Now I'm going to go in and make an adjustment to this brush now, and even go a little bit farther with that temperature if I'd like. There we go, just to really bring out that blue. I'm also going to increase the contrast, which is going to punch it up just slightly. Increase the exposure just a little bit. Oh, maybe not so much. There we go. And increase the clarity, which is going to add a lot of punch to the image as well. Maybe just a little bit there. Perfect. So now I've brought back a lot of the blues that were in this image that didn't quite make it onto the sensor when I took the photo. Now I'm going to make a few other minor adjustments. If I zoom in here to the back of the image, there's actually a hiker in the background sneaking their way into the photo. I'm going to go up here in the upper right hand corner and click on this little cloning or healing tool here, and I can adjust the size for pretty much where I see the hiker's head there. Click on that. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to sample a part of the image that I think will blend in really well, and I'm going to release. I'm going to close that panel, and there goes the hiker. He's gone. Now there's a lot more that I can do to this image as far as cloning and healing and things like that. If you want to remove some dust or some aspects of the image that you're not too happy with, but that's pretty much all I'm going to do as far as cloning and healing. Now I want to bring up a little bit of the green in these in the brush here in these bushes. Now in order to do that, I'm going to go back to my adjustment panel here, scroll down to the Hue, Saturation, and Luminance (HSL) panel here, and I'm going to do a few different things. First of all, I'm going to click on Luminance right under that panel. Luminance is how bright you're going to make a color, how bright you can brighten or darken just a specific range of colors. Now, in my first tutorial, I explained how usually when you see grass or trees in a picture, you'd be surprised at how much yellow there is in that rather than just green. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the green first, the brightness of the greens, and then I'm going to increase the brightness of the yellows. And you'll notice how those just bump up a little bit there. Okay, and I can go a little bit farther with that if I'd like. They're pretty dark. There we go. Now I'm going to go and click on the Saturation tab within this panel. Saturation is, again, the vividness of the color, how intense a particular range of colors is. And again, I'm going to go ahead into the greens. I'm going to punch the greens up a little bit. And then I'm also going to punch up the yellows a little bit. and you'll see how I've brought a lot back to the image. I've made a selective adjustment just to that range of colors rather than brightening everything in the whole image. Okay, and I think I'm good there. Now you can also make adjustments to the blues as well. Like if I wanted to make the blue sky a little bit bluer, but I don't want to go too crazy with that. You enter the realm of fantasy, and then it's not so much fun. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with this image overall. There's a couple of minor things I like to do to finish up an image. First of all, I'll go back to this tone curve and see if I can maybe push the lights a little more. Just slightly. And one other thing that I like to do to finish off images is add a little bit of a vignette. That darkens the edges of the image and it draws the viewer down into the center of the image, or adds a lot of depth into that image. So I'm going to scroll down here to the effects panel and post-crop vignetting, and I'm going to drag this amount slider down here just to darken the edges slightly. Then I'm going to go to the feather adjustment, and I'm going to drag that up a little bit. Feathering smooths the transition between the darks and the lights, so it makes the effect a little bit more subtle. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with this image here. There's a lot more that I can do, just minor things, but let's go ahead and look at a before and after. I always like to do that and show you where we started from a raw image and how we got all this way just using the tools that Lightroom gives you with no special plugins or anything. So let's look at a before and an after. One more time, a before and an after. Okay, so there's so many things you could do with Lightroom just within these basic adjustment panels. I've gone over a lot of more advanced techniques as well. Alright, let's take one more look at a comparison, sort of a before and after again. Side by side, just so you can see where we started and where we finished. And let's get rid of a little bit of the clutter here. And there you have it. As always, if you have any questions over any of the topics I've gone over today, please don't hesitate to email me. I'll post my email at the end of this video, or post a comment on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you happen to find this. Well, thank you so much again for joining me on the adventurebook.net, and remember, adventure is out there.